"You were a mistake. My dad said it on my birthday." My mom didn't argue. She just stared at me for a long moment, then whispered that I was never meant to be born. That day I turned 18. No cake, no candles, just a door slamming shut behind me, and no one planning to ever open it again. I left with nothing. No money, no home, not even a name someone called with love. For a while, I truly believed my story would end right there on that cold, forgotten sidewalk. But then, a stranger stopped. He looked at me. Not with pity, not with fear. He just looked, and he didn't look away long enough for me to believe he might walk off like everyone else. But instead, he opened his mouth, and everything that came after was never the same. The house had always felt smaller to me on days that mattered. Birthdays, holidays, any moment that asked for a pause, a smile, an acknowledgement that someone existed and was worth keeping. That morning was no different. The hallway was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. I woke up knowing it was my birthday because the date had been circling my thoughts for weeks, not because anyone mentioned it. The calendar on the wall had the square marked in my handwriting. Small, careful letters, like I was afraid of taking up too much space. I had written my name there once, almost tentatively. Clara. I moved through the kitchen the way I always did, quietly without drawing attention. My brother's things were everywhere. His jacket slung over a chair, his bag by the door, evidence of his life, his place. Mine was a narrow strip on the counter where I kept what I needed and nothing more. When he came in, our parents' voices softened without them meaning to. When I spoke, the room seemed to tighten as if I'd done something wrong by opening my mouth. That had been the pattern for as long as I could remember. He was the one they worried about, the one whose mistakes were explained away as phases, stress potential. If he forgot something, it was because he had too much on his mind. If I did, it was because I wasn't paying attention. He was always becoming something. I was always correcting myself. The favoritism was never spoken aloud, but it lived in every glance, every decision, every silence that followed my name. I tried not to expect anything that morning. Expectation was dangerous. Expectation made disappointment louder. Still, I hoped quietly, foolishly, that maybe 18 would be different, that there would be some recognition that reaching adulthood meant something, even if it was just a nod, a sentence, a moment of acknowledgement that I had lasted this long. We sat at the table, the three of us, while my brother rushed through his breakfast and complained about being late. My father nodded, distracted already on his phone. My mother watched him, attentive, in a way I had learned not to want. No one looked at me. The clock ticked steady and indifferent. After my brother left, the silence settled again. That was when my father cleared his throat and said we needed to talk. The words themselves weren't unusual. What followed was, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke as if he were stating a fact he'd been carrying for years, waiting for the right moment to set down. You were a mistake. The sentence landed between us, complete and final. It didn't ask to be argued with. It didn't need evidence. It simply existed. I looked to my mother, waiting for her to interrupt, to soften it, to say something, anything that would make it less permanent. She didn't. She looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved. Then she leaned closer, lowered her voice, and whispered that I was never meant to be born. She said my name once softly, without warmth. Clara. There are words that echo, not because they're loud, but because there's nowhere for them to go. They filled the room, pressed against my chest, made it hard to breathe. I waited for the rest, for the explanation, the justification, the part where this made sense. None of that came. Instead, my father said I was old enough now to take care of myself, that it was time, that it would be better this way, better for whom wasn't discussed. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with my hands, my face the fact that my life had just been reduced to a conclusion they'd reached without me. My brother wasn't there to hear it. He never was when it mattered. I wondered briefly what he would say if he were. Then I realized it didn't matter. Silence had always been his choice. I went to my room and packed what I could. It didn't take long. When you grow up learning not to claim space, you don't own much. A change of clothes, my documents, a few things that proved I existed in places that weren't that house. I paused once, holding an object I'd had since childhood, then put it back. Some things belong to the past, even when the past doesn't want you. No one followed me. No one asked where I was going. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt deliberate, as if it were confirming what had already been decided. I stood on the porch for a second, waiting for a voice to call my name. Clara. It didn't happen. The street was quieter than I expected. Cars passed. People moved on with their lives. I walked without direction because direction required options, and I didn't have any yet. My phone showed a handful of contacts. I tried one. It went to voicemail. I tried another. A polite apology followed something about not being able to help. No anger, no cruelty, just distance. As the day wore on, the weight of it all settled in. 18, an age people celebrate as a beginning. For me, it felt like an ending I hadn't been allowed to prepare for. I counted what little money I had and stopped counting when it made me feel worse. I found a place to sit where I wouldn't be noticed, where I could think without being asked questions I couldn't answer. I thought about the house I'd just left, about how easy it was for them to erase me, about how my absence would simplify things. No more tension, no more explaining, no more Clara. There was a moment quiet and dangerous when I wondered if they were right, if my existence really had been a mistake, a complication, something that never fit the plan. It's a terrifying thought, the idea that the people who brought you into the world never intended for you to be there, that you survived on borrowed time, waiting for someone to notice and correct the error. The light shifted as the afternoon turned toward evening. The air grew colder. I hugged my jacket closer, trying to stay present, trying not to disappear into the thoughts that wanted to pull me under. I told myself I just needed to get through the night, that tomorrow I could figure something out, that survival didn't have to be elegant, it just had to be enough. The first few blocks passed in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, every house a reminder that people were inside eating dinner, arguing, laughing, existing in ways that didn't include me. I reached into my pocket and felt the thin outline of my phone, heavier than it should have been because of what it represented. The last fragile thread connecting me to people who knew my name. I stopped walking long enough to scroll through my contacts, hesitating before tapping the first one. The call rang until it stopped on its own. I didn't leave a message. I told myself they were busy. I told myself that didn't mean anything yet. I tried another number, someone I had once helped with homework, someone who had called me reliable, which had sounded like praise at the time. This time they answered. Their voice was polite, concerned, in a distant way, the kind of concern that keeps its shoes on in case it needs to leave quickly. I explained just enough to make sense, not enough to sound desperate. There was a pause, then an apology that arrived fully formed, like it had been waiting behind their teeth. They said they wished they could help. They said it wasn't a good time. They said maybe someone else would be better. I thanked them before they could feel awkward and ended the call myself because it felt important not to be the one hung up on. I didn't call anyone else after that. 2 attempts were enough to teach me what the rest would look like. No one was cruel. No one slammed a door in my face. They simply didn't open them. There's a particular loneliness in that kind of rejection, the kind that leaves no villain to point to, only a series of reasonable choices that don't include you. By the time the sun dipped lower, the truth settled in with a dull weight. I had been abandoned by my family, and now I had nowhere to go at 18 years old, except forward into whatever came next. I found a bench near a stretch of buildings where people moved with purpose, where I could blend into the background and not be noticed for sitting too long. I checked my bag again as if something might have multiplied while I wasn't looking. A few dollars in loose bills, my ID, a handful of things that proved who I was but not where I belonged. No plan, no safety net. I tried to think practically because panic wastes energy, and energy felt like a resource I couldn't afford to lose. I needed somewhere to sleep that wouldn't draw attention, somewhere that didn't ask questions. I needed to decide whether dignity mattered more than warmth, whether being unseen was safer than being comfortable. The city has a way of offering choices that don't feel like choices at all. As evening approached, I watched people claim spaces without thinking about it, leaning against walls, sitting in cafes, unlocking doors. I weighed my options carefully, aware that the wrong one could make me vulnerable in ways I wasn't ready to face. I chose a spot that was visible enough to feel safe, but unimportant enough to be ignored, and I sat there folding myself inward, trying to take up as little space as possible. It occurred to me not for the first time that I had spent most of my life practicing this exact skill. The realization that followed was sharp and unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Being abandoned didn't mean I was useless. It meant I hadn't been chosen. The distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. Useless things are thrown away because they have no function. Unchosen things are left behind because someone decided they didn't fit. The question that rose up inside me was quiet but relentless. If my own family didn't keep me, if the people who were supposed to hold the line had let go without hesitation, then how was I supposed to hold myself together? My brother's face drifted into my thoughts without warning, not as a source of anger, but as a point of comparison that refused to go away. He would be at home now, complaining about dinner, asking questions that would be answered, being watched in that careful way that said he mattered. He would have a place to sleep that night without having to think about it. I didn't envy him so much as I acknowledged the difference between us with a kind of cold clarity. I hadn't been pushed out because I had done something unforgivable. I had been pushed out because in the final calculation, I was expendable. The night deepened, and with it came a small, humiliating incident that drove the lesson home. I shifted my bag closer to my feet, only to realize a moment later that something was missing. I checked again more urgently this time, my fingers moving faster as unease crept in. My wallet was gone. I retraced my steps in my mind, trying to pinpoint when it might have slipped away, but the details blurred together. I stood up and looked around, scanning faces that had no reason to look back at me. No one met my eyes. No one seemed to notice. I approached a nearby security guard, explaining what had happened in a voice I worked hard to keep steady. He listened, nodding, then asked a few questions that made it clear there was nothing to be done. He wasn't unkind. He just didn't have time for problems that didn't belong to him. When he asked me to move along to find another place to sit, I felt a familiar heat rise in my chest, the sting of being treated like an inconvenience. I complied without arguing because arguing required leverage, and I had none. As I walked away, a thought surfaced that was both painful and clarifying. I had spent years asking for permission to exist, lowering my voice, shrinking my needs, hoping that being agreeable would earn me a place. It hadn't worked. Silence had kept me safe in my parents' house for a while, but it hadn't kept me there. Silence had followed me out the door and onto the street, and it was becoming clear that it wasn't going to save me now either. I found another place to sit as the sky darkened fully, my body tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The city grew quieter, but not kinder. I wrapped my arms around myself, less for warmth than for the reassurance of pressure, of something holding me together. A decision formed slowly, not as a dramatic vow, but as a simple refusal. If no one was going to hold me, then I would have to do it myself. Not perfectly, not heroically, just enough to make it through the night. I realized then how accustomed I was to disappearing, to making myself small, so others could remain comfortable. It had been my role in the family, the one who didn't make demands, the one who absorbed blame quietly. That habit had followed me here into the dark, where it offered no protection at all. The understanding didn't fix anything, but it shifted something inside me, a tiny adjustment that felt like the beginning of resistance. That was when I became aware of someone watching me, not staring, not intruding, just observing from a distance that felt deliberate. I didn't look right away. I had learned that acknowledging attention could invite the wrong kind of interaction. But the awareness persisted steady and unsettling until I finally lifted my gaze. The figure was indistinct, in the low light, standing far enough away to be ambiguous, close enough to be intentional. He didn't step closer right away, and that was the first thing that made me uneasy, because most people who stop either rush in to perform kindness or hurry past to avoid it, and he did neither. He stood where he was far enough that I could leave if I wanted to, close enough that leaving would feel like a decision instead of an escape, and the silence between us stretched until it felt intentional, like something he was testing rather than a pause he didn't know how to fill. I didn't know what he was looking for or what he saw when he looked at me. I only knew that I didn't have the energy to move again, not tonight. If he meant to approach, he would. If he meant to leave, I would let him. I stayed where I was rooted in place by exhaustion and a strange, stubborn resolve. I had been running all day. I didn't have it in me to keep running forever. The night stretched on quiet and watchful, and I sat there suspended between what I had lost and whatever might come next, aware of his eyes on me, and uncertain what they would mean. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and unhurried, as if time wasn't something he needed to borrow from me. He didn't ask where my parents were or why I was alone or what had happened earlier that day. He asked something smaller and sharper, something rooted in the present rather than the wreckage behind it. He asked how long I planned to stay where I was sitting. The question caught me off guard because it assumed I had a plan, or at least the authority to make one. I opened my mouth, then closed it, realizing I didn't know how to answer without explaining myself, and explaining myself was a reflex I was trying to unlearn. I told him I didn't know. The words felt insufficient, but they were honest. He nodded once as if that answer fit somewhere in his mind without needing adjustment, and then he asked another question, one that landed harder than the first. He asked whether I wanted to keep drifting or whether I wanted structure, and the way he said it made it clear that neither option came with a promise of comfort. I felt a familiar urge to justify, to soften my response to make myself palatable, but he waited without prompting, and that waiting felt like pressure in a different direction. I realized then how unaccustomed I was to being asked to choose without first being asked to confess. My life had been an endless audition, every decision filtered through the need to explain why I deserved it. Standing there under the quiet weight of his attention, I felt exposed, not because he knew too much about me, but because he knew nothing and still expected an answer. I shifted on the bench, aware of how small I felt, how easy it would be to say nothing and let the moment pass to remain exactly where I was because it required no risk. He didn't fill the silence when I hesitated. He didn't reassure me or push me or frame the choice as something noble. He simply waited, and that waiting made it clear that whatever happened next would be mine to own. Eventually, I said that drifting hadn't worked out so well so far. It wasn't clever or brave, but it was enough. He nodded again, then told me what he could offer, and the way he did it made all the difference. He didn't say he would take me in. He didn't say he would help me get back on my feet. He described a set of conditions the way someone describes a contract plainly and without embellishment. There was a place where I could stay temporarily, not indefinitely, and it wasn't free. It came with work, real work, the kind that required showing up on time and following rules that wouldn't bend for my feelings. There were expectations and boundaries, and there was no guarantee of what would happen after. He made it clear that I was an adult that I could refuse, that nothing about the arrangement required gratitude or loyalty beyond what was agreed upon. I listened carefully, my mind catching on certain phrases and holding on to them. Temporary, conditions, no promises. He wasn't offering a future, he was offering a framework. The honesty of it unsettled me more than false kindness ever had. I asked him what kind of work, and he answered without hesitation, outlining tasks that sounded simple until I imagined myself doing them under scrutiny. He told me I could think about it, but not for long. Structure, he said, only works if you enter it willingly. The choice pressed in on me from both sides. If I stayed where I was, nothing would change, and there was a strange safety in that familiarity, even as it threatened to swallow me whole. If I went with him, I would be stepping into something cold and defined, something that didn't care about my past or my pain, something that would judge me by what I did next, rather than what had been done to me. Neither option promised safety. One promised stasis, the other promised accountability. I didn't ask him if he was trustworthy. I didn't ask what he got out of it. I understood instinctively that those questions would shift the responsibility back onto him, and something in me resisted that. I was tired of waiting to be chosen, tired of placing my survival in other people's hands and calling it hope. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my legs, and told him I would go. The words felt strange in my mouth, heavy with consequence. He accepted them without ceremony, as if this was the expected outcome of a conversation conducted honestly. As we walked, I noticed the way he kept a measured distance, not leading, and not following too closely, And I wondered if that was intentional too. The streets looked different from this angle, less like obstacles and more like passages, and I focused on keeping pace, on staying present. My thoughts flickered toward the possibility of regret, toward the fear of being foolish, but underneath it all was a steadier realization that surprised me with its clarity. I was choosing this. Whatever happened next would not be an extension of someone else's decision to discard me. The place we arrived at was unremarkable in a way that felt deliberate. There were no welcoming gestures, no attempt to soften the edges. He showed me where things were, explained the rules without commentary, and pointed out what would be expected of me starting the next day. The neutrality of the space pressed against me, stripping away any lingering fantasies I might have harbored about rescue or transformation. This was not a home. It was a proving ground. As he spoke, I found myself cataloging his words with a precision I hadn't used in a long time, noting where flexibility ended and responsibility began. There was relief in that clarity, even as it terrified me. I had spent years navigating shifting expectations, trying to anticipate moods and manage outcomes. Here the lines were drawn plainly, and crossing them would have consequences that were spelled out in advance. I didn't know if I could succeed, but I knew what failure would look like, and that knowledge steadied me in an unexpected way. Later, when I was alone with my thoughts, the weight of what I had done settled in. I thought about trust, about how reflexively I withheld it, not just from others, but from myself. I had learned early that trusting the wrong person could cost you everything, but I was beginning to see that trusting no one at all carried its own kind of erasure. The fear wasn't that he might deceive me. The fear was that I might freeze, that I might become so cautious that I never moved again. I reminded myself of the terms. I was an adult. I had chosen to stay. There were conditions, clear ones, and no hidden debts I could sense beneath them. If this ended badly, it would end because I had stepped forward and misjudged, not because I had been pushed. That distinction mattered more than I could articulate, anchoring me in a sense of agency that felt fragile but real. The first task he set for me was simple in description and difficult in execution. It required making a decision without seeking approval, required acting on incomplete information, and accepting the outcome without defense. My instinct was to ask for guidance, to defer, but something in his expression told me that doing so would miss the point entirely. I took a breath and made the call myself, aware of how my hands shook as I did it, aware of how exposed I felt without the shield of compliance. The result wasn't perfect. There were small errors, moments where I second-guessed too late or moved too quickly, but I didn't retreat. When it was over, I waited for the familiar rush of shame, the urge to apologize preemptively, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet, unfamiliar sensation that settled in my chest, something like relief tempered by resolve. For the first time, my value hadn't been measured by how much I endured, but by whether I stepped forward at all. That night, as I lay awake in a space that felt neither safe nor hostile, I examined that feeling carefully. I thought about how often I had mistaken endurance for worth, how suffering had become my currency in a household that never planned to invest in me. Here, suffering bought nothing. Action did. Choice did. Even failure, if it came, would be accounted for honestly. When he spoke to me again before leaving, his words were brief and unsentimental. He didn't tell me I would be fine. He didn't offer reassurance dressed up as wisdom. He told me that staying meant standing upright, that there would be no room for collapse disguised as humility. The simplicity of it struck me harder than any speech could have. There was no romance in what he offered, no guarantee of belonging, only the possibility of not being erased if I refused to erase myself. As the door closed behind him, not with finality, but with expectation, I understood that another door had closed as well. One that led back to the version of myself who waited to be told whether she was allowed to remain. I sat there in the quiet, aware of the work ahead and the risks I had accepted, and for the first time since my birthday, the ground beneath me felt solid enough to stand on, not because it was kind, but because it was real. The first morning began without ceremony, without anyone asking whether I had slept or eaten or needed time to adjust, and that absence landed harder than any cruelty because it stripped away the last illusion that I had been brought somewhere to be cared for. I woke to the sound of movement already underway. Doors opening and closing, phones vibrating softly on desks, voices already discussing timelines that didn't include me. My body felt stiff, in a way that told me I hadn't rested properly, but there was no signal that this mattered. I was given a schedule, a desk in the corner of an open floor, and a list of tasks routed through a shared system, all delivered in the same neutral tone one might use for equipment rather than people. The investment fund operated on precision, and I learned quickly that my name appeared on the task board the way a label does. Accurate, impersonal, sufficient only to indicate where responsibility would land. No one asked about my past. No one hinted at curiosity. No one made space for hesitation. I wasn't pushed aside, but I wasn't buffered either, and I realized quickly that here being allowed to stay did not mean being protected. The environment operated on its own internal logic, one that didn't bend for personal history or unspoken wounds. Processes were already in motion before I touched them. Dependencies mapped out in advance, decisions queued for approval, whether I understood them yet or not. Instructions arrived clean and contained stripped of explanation, and my attention narrowed to execution. What needed to be done by when, and what failure would interrupt downstream. At one point, the man who had brought me here stated it directly, not as a lesson, but as a fact. Everyone has reasons to complain, but only those who produce results are kept. He said it the same way someone might explain a constraint. No emphasis, no threat. The sentence passed through the room like a draft of cold air. I felt it settle in my shoulders before it reached my thoughts. A tightening I didn't consciously release because I had survived my entire life by enduring, by absorbing pressure quietly, by mistaking tolerance for worth. Here, endurance didn't register as value. It didn't show up in reports. It didn't affect outcomes. It simply disappeared into the background. I worked among people who moved with efficiency that had nothing to do with kindness. I understood quickly that no one hated me. They simply didn't need me yet. My presence was provisional, dependent on what I could execute rather than what I had survived, and that distinction reshaped the ground beneath my feet. Instructions were given once, sometimes twice, never more. When mistakes happened, they weren't dramatized. They were logged. Timestamps notes a quiet mark in a system that remembered without emotion. A minor error on my part didn't earn a reprimand or a lecture. It became a line item attached to my name. I noticed it only later, the way an update had been added without comment, and the permanence of it unsettled me more than anger would have. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when I realized how ineffective my old strategies were here. At home, silence had bought me time. It had softened blows, reduced scrutiny, allowed me to stay unnoticed. In this system, silence translated as absence. If I didn't speak during a handoff, someone else finalized the decision. If I didn't claim a task, it was reassigned without discussion. I watched it happen more than once, responsibilities sliding past me because I hadn't anchored them early enough. I wasn't punished for withdrawing. I was rendered irrelevant. And irrelevance was the fastest way out. That understanding crystallized during a small but consequential incident. A task moved forward with incomplete parameters, not catastrophically, but enough to require correction. Because I had been present during the discussion without clarifying a dependency, the responsibility drifted toward me. No accusation, no blame, just weight settling where it encountered the least resistance. The old reflex rose immediately, the instinct to absorb it, to smooth the situation by taking responsibility that wasn't fully mine. My mouth opened before I decided to speak, then closed again. For a few seconds I hovered on the edge of that choice, aware of how familiar it felt, how comforting it was to disappear inside accountability. The alternative was exposure. Speaking meant interrupting the flow, drawing attention, risking irritation. It meant placing myself inside the decision chain instead of beneath it. My hands trembled faintly, and I pressed them against the edge of the table to steady myself. Not because I felt brave, but because I understood the cost of repeating the old pattern. I corrected the assumption calmly. I stated the facts as they stood, clarified what I owned and what I didn't, and accepted responsibility only for what was actually mine. I didn't soften it. I didn't over-explain. My voice held. My fingers stayed tense long after I finished. The aftermath was quiet in the way real systems respond. No thanks. no apology. The process simply adjusted. The task was rerouted correctly. The discussion moved on. But something shifted. Instructions began to arrive addressed to me directly rather than around me. Tasks stopped defaulting to my silence. I wasn't liked more, but I was seen. For the first time, I experienced a form of power that didn't come from being agreeable, but from being precise. Later, the man who had set the conditions spoke to me again, not about the incident itself, but adjacent to it. He didn't praise or criticize. He didn't ask how I felt. He said only that in this system, silence removes your name from consideration. Then he walked away, leaving the sentence to stand on its own. As the day wore on, my body adapted to the rhythm faster than my thoughts did. I anticipated requests instead of reacting to them. I learned where approvals bottlenecked, where delays accumulated, where attention mattered. There was no sense of safety, but there was structure. And structure offered a different kind of stability, one that didn't depend on mood or favor. I didn't think about my family or the night I'd spent outside. Those memories felt distant not because they'd lost their sting, but because they no longer had currency here. Pain was not leveraged. History was not capital. Only what I did next mattered. That realization brought a pared-down clarity. I wasn't here to be understood. I wasn't here to be redeemed. I was here to function, to operate inside a system that didn't care why I needed to succeed, only whether I could. The thought unsettled me and relieved me. I didn't have to justify my presence with suffering. I didn't have to translate my wounds into explanations. I could act. By the end of the day, exhaustion settled into my muscles. Not from strain, but from attention. When I finally sat still, I became aware of how much energy I had once spent monitoring others, adjusting myself to expectations that were never explicit. Here, expectations were visible. Meeting them required vigilance outward, not inward. That night alone, I examined the shift with detached curiosity. Endurance had once been my primary skill. It has kept me tolerated. It had not kept me chosen. Here, endurance alone meant nothing. Without action, it erased me. The thought that followed was simple and frightening. Pain no longer helped me survive. If I wanted to remain, I would have to risk being wrong, step into decisions without the shield of silence. Failure would be visible, owned, attributable. Silence would remove me without a trace. As I prepared for the next day, the question wasn't whether I could endure what lay ahead. It was whether I could tolerate the exposure competence demanded. Endurance had been my armor. Letting it go felt like standing without protection. But armor had only ever kept me contained, never effective. Here, no one was coming to save me. And for the first time, that wasn't a sentence, it was a condition. For a brief stretch of time, things felt almost stable. Not good exactly, but predictable enough that my body stopped bracing for impact every time my name appeared in a thread or was spoken across a table. I noticed it first in my shoulders, the way they no longer tensed automatically when someone paused near my desk. I learned the rhythm of the days, the order in which tasks arrived through the system, the quiet signals that meant something needed attention before it escalated. I wasn't praised, but I wasn't corrected often either, and that absence of correction began to feel like progress. I caught myself thinking carefully that maybe I had figured out how to stay, how to exist here, without triggering review or scrutiny, and the thought scared me precisely because it felt earned. The illusion didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through small operational moments, through the way people stopped double-checking my inputs, through the way my updates no longer prompted follow-up questions, through the way my presence didn't interrupt the flow of discussion. I started to believe that competence might be something I could grow into quietly, without risk, without exposure. I told myself that consistency was enough, that if I kept my head down and executed cleanly, I could avoid the sharp edges that had cut me before. I moved efficiently, documented carefully, spoke only when necessary, and felt a cautious relief each time a reporting cycle closed without issue. It was the same strategy I had used my entire life, just dressed in operational language, and it took me too long to recognize it for what it was. The first real test came disguised as an ordinary assignment, one that didn't look dangerous until it asked me to step forward instead of sideways. It wasn't technically difficult, and that was part of the trap. The task didn't come with a checklist. It came with incomplete information, a compressed timeline, and a decision window that belonged to whoever claimed it. I was told it was mine to handle, and the words carried weight I wasn't prepared for. The kind that settles on your shoulders, slowly making you feel taller and more fragile at the same time. I nodded and took the materials, my hand steady, my pulse already beginning to climb. I accepted without hesitation, because refusing would have been a louder failure, and because something in me wanted to believe I was ready. As soon as I was alone with it, doubt crept in, quiet and corrosive. I sat with the information spread in front of me, reviewing the same figures, rereading the same notes, as if repetition might turn uncertainty into clarity. I saw too many possible outcomes, too many downstream consequences, too many ways to be wrong. The old fear tightened its grip. If I decided and failed, I would attach my name permanently to the outcome. If I waited, someone else would step in, and the failure would be quieter, procedural, easier to survive. The choice sat in front of me, demanding movement, and I responded the way I always had, by freezing and calling it caution. Time passed while I weighed options that didn't need weighing. Each minute that slipped by felt both safe and dangerous. I checked details that didn't change the decision, adjusted variables that weren't decisive, told myself I was being thorough. I told myself I was mitigating risk. In truth, I was watching the decision window close and hoping someone would intervene before I had to act. When clarity finally arrived, it came too late. The handoff had already happened. The decision had been made upstream. The consequences unfolded without drama. Efficient, documented, irreversible. I watched as someone else stepped in to stabilize what I had failed to secure. No one raised their voice. No one accused me outright. The correction was clean and procedural, and that was what made it sting. Responsibility wasn't revoked loudly. It was simply redistributed. I felt the shift immediately, the way ownership moved away from me and settled elsewhere, and the loss landed with a dull finality. This wasn't a punishment. It was an adjustment. And adjustments like this were rarely reversed without reason. The weight of it pressed in slowly, giving me time to understand exactly what I had done. I hadn't failed because I lacked ability. I had failed because I couldn't bring myself to decide. The realization cut deeper than any reprimand could have because it connected too neatly to the past I had been trying not to revisit. I had been trained carefully and repeatedly not to act unless I was certain, not to speak unless invited, not to choose unless the cost was already known. Mistakes had never been treated as learning. They had been treated as evidence. The thoughts surfaced with painful clarity. I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of being proven a mistake. The difference mattered. Failure was an event. Being a mistake was a verdict, one that lingered long after the moment had passed. I had learned to avoid that verdict by avoiding risk altogether, by staying in the narrow space where nothing could be attributed to me. Here, that space didn't exist, and my old instincts had betrayed me at the first real opportunity. When the man who oversaw the structure called me aside, I braced myself automatically, my jaw tightening before he even spoke. The consequences didn't come in the form I expected. He didn't scold me or soften the moment with reassurance. He asked one question, direct and unadorned, and waited. He asked why I hadn't decided. The simplicity of it stripped away every defense I might have used. There was no room to talk about pressure or ambiguity without sounding like an excuse, and for the first time, I didn't want to sound excusable. I wanted to be accurate. I told him the truth as plainly as I could manage. I said I was afraid of being wrong. The words felt small in the air between us, inadequate, but closer to the center than anything else I could have offered. He didn't respond right away. He didn't reinterpret my answer into something more flattering. He let it stand, then nodded once as if he had heard exactly what he needed to hear. The conversation ended without resolution, without comfort, leaving me alone with the consequences of my own hesitation. In the quiet that followed, something shifted inside me. Not with relief, but with recognition. For the first time, I saw my patterns without the haze of self-justification. I saw how often I had confused survival with safety, how often I had delayed action until the window closed and called it prudence. I didn't tell myself a story about growth or resilience. I didn't frame the failure as a lesson with neat edges. I simply accepted it as mine. No one else had forced my silence. No one else had delayed my hand. If I was going to stay here, I would have to own that truth without turning it into a weapon against myself. Later, I was given a choice that felt deceptively simple. I could step back into work that didn't require judgment, reduce my exposure, preserve what little ground I had gained. Or I could remain where I was, accept the risk that came with deciding, and learn how to fail without disappearing. The offer wasn't encouragement. It was structural. I surprised myself by not asking for time. I didn't negotiate. I said I would stay. The decision didn't feel brave. It felt necessary, like choosing to stand when sitting would mean not standing up again. I didn't promise improvement. I accepted the terms as they were because anything less would have been another way of hiding. That night, the familiar urge to spiral into self-criticism rose and fell without finding purchase. I didn't excuse myself, but I didn't condemn myself either. I thought about how many years I had spent avoiding mistakes by avoiding choice, and how that strategy had narrowed my life until it could be taken away in a single adjustment. Here, the cost of avoiding mistakes was visible and immediate, and that clarity gave me something I hadn't had before. A reason to change that didn't depend on being forgiven. Fear wasn't the enemy, inaction was. The shift was subtle enough that I almost missed it, which was exactly how it was meant to be. Nothing signals exclusion more efficiently than politeness. Conversations didn't stop when I entered the room. They simply ended a second earlier, voices lowering, as if the conclusion had already been scheduled. Decisions didn't arrive for discussion. They arrived, finalized, smoothed by alignment that had happened without me. No one mentioned the earlier misstep. No one revisited it aloud. The silence carried more weight than criticism ever could, because it implied resolution without my participation. I wasn't being punished. I was being assessed. And the assessment was happening without me present. I noticed it first in logistics long before it registered emotionally. Meetings appeared on my calendar after they had already taken place. Documents reached me once assumptions were locked and ranges narrowed. My role shifted quietly from shaping inputs to executing outputs. Tasks came with tighter parameters and fewer decision points. Everything was efficient, reasonable, and defensible. From the outside, it looked like optimization. From where I stood, it felt like being eased out of the frame. No one attacked me. No one blamed me. I was simply no longer central, and the system didn't owe me an explanation for that. The person who embodied the shift wasn't cruel or careless. They were competent and methodical, the kind of operator who kept processes stable by minimizing exposure. When they spoke, attention aligned instinctively. Pens paused. No one interrupted. They never mentioned my name directly, never attached emotion to the situation. In one review meeting, they asked a question that sounded entirely reasonable: whether it was prudent to assign additional decision authority to someone who had recently hesitated under pressure. The question lingered. No one contradicted it. No one looked at me. It didn't accuse me of incompetence. It framed me as a variable, one that introduced uncertainty into a system designed to reduce it. That was the moment I understood what was happening. I wasn't being edged out because I lacked skill. I was being edged out because I represented risk. Systems like this don't dislike risk. They manage it. And I had just been flagged as something that required containment. The logic was sound, which made it difficult to challenge. There was no injustice to appeal to, no bias to confront directly. The evaluation that followed was orderly. Performance data was referenced. Timelines were reviewed. My earlier hesitation was acknowledged without exaggeration or mitigation. The proposed solution was framed as an adjustment rather than a demotion. A reduction in scope, a shift toward work with clearer guardrails, a position where my presence would stabilize execution rather than complicate decisions. No one said I would be removed. No one needed to. As the discussion unfolded, an old reflex stirred in me, the instinct to explain, to contextualize, to translate intention into reassurance. I could feel the sentences lining up, ready to justify why hesitation shouldn't define me, why given time I would prove myself reliable. My mouth opened once, then closed. The urge to speak wasn't driven by strategy. It was driven by habit. I had spent years believing that if I explained myself clearly enough, I could earn patience. Sitting there watching the recalibration finalize without my input, I realized how little patience explanations actually buy. The thought settled quietly and stayed. Every time I had been pushed aside before, it wasn't because I was the worst option. It was because I was the easiest one to remove. I wasn't protected by seniority or buffered by reputation. My absence didn't disrupt the system. The realization didn't trigger anger or self-pity. It clarified the terrain. If I wanted to remain, I would have to change the calculation, not the narrative. So when the moment came for me to respond, I did something that surprised even me. I didn't argue the assessment. I didn't defend my past performance. I didn't ask to be kept. Instead, I slid a single page forward and proposed something specific. I outlined a responsibility that hadn't yet been formally assigned, one that carried measurable risk and required sustained ownership. I stated what I would deliver, how success would be evaluated, and what failure would mean in concrete operational terms. I didn't appeal to potential. I didn't mention effort. I spoke only to outcomes. The room remained neutral. A few people exchanged looks, calculating rather than hostile. The proposal wasn't dismissed, but it wasn't embraced either. It hovered between possible and impractical, and I felt the weight of that uncertainty settle across my shoulders. The man who had brought me into the system was there watching. He didn't intervene. His silence wasn't indifference. It was examination. Responses came unevenly. Some questioned feasibility, framing concerns as risk mitigation. Others said nothing at all, which I recognized as resistance without fingerprints. There was no consensus, but there was no rejection either. When the meeting adjourned, I stayed seated for a moment after the room emptied. I felt exposed but steady. I hadn't pleaded or withdrawn. I had placed something on the table that could be evaluated independently of my past, and that shift mattered. Whether it would work was still uncertain, but the uncertainty now belonged to the outcome, not to me as a person. Later, another realization settled in. Waiting to be chosen meant allowing others to decide when I mattered. If I wanted to stay, I couldn't rely on selection. I would have to make my removal inconvenient. Not through drama or force, but by occupying a function the system needed too much to eliminate easily. That understanding didn't make me fearless. It narrowed my focus. Fear became something to manage, not a signal to retreat. I began preparing for the responsibility I had proposed, knowing that readiness itself would be visible. I worked quietly, mapping dependencies, building contingencies, identifying where risk could be absorbed without destabilizing the structure. When the decision finally came, it arrived without ceremony. The responsibility was assigned to me with conditions and caveats. No one congratulated me. No one warned me. The terms were clear, and for the first time they felt fair. There were no safety nets, no quiet corner to retreat to. The risk belonged to me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt alert. This wasn't a rescue or a reward. It was a test, and I had placed myself directly in its path. Later alone, I traced the pattern that had brought me here. How often I had mistaken patience for strategy. How often I had waited for permission to matter. I didn't need everyone to choose me. I needed the system to do what I could do. Standing still wasn't neutrality. It was eliminated by default. As I prepared to begin the work, no one had wanted. The absence of encouragement felt almost reassuring. There was no narrative to perform against, no expectation to satisfy. There was only the work and the risk it carried. If I failed, I would know exactly why. And if I succeeded, it wouldn't be because someone had taken a chance on me. It would be because I had made myself worth the bet. The days before it unfolded were quieter than I expected, not because the pressure had eased, but because there was no one left to absorb it for me. Once the responsibility was formally mine, guidance stopped completely. No interim reviews, no reassurance disguised as concern. I understood then that this wasn't neglect. It was designed. This was what it meant to step forward voluntarily. There would be no corrections before the fact, only consequences after. The task itself wasn't impossible, which was what made it dangerous. It fit my strengths too closely to dismiss, yet arrived under compressed timelines and imperfect conditions that left no margin for error. The data was incomplete, dependencies shifted, external variables refused to cooperate. From the outside, it looked like poor timing. A few people hinted at that carefully, their warnings framed as friendliness so they wouldn't be responsible for the outcome. I listened, but I didn't respond. None of them would own the result. As opinions multiplied, I recognized the pattern immediately. Advice came easily when accountability did not follow. For the first time, I didn't reach for consensus or validation. I stood with the information I had and made a decision that felt almost unremarkable. A narrow adjustment, a deviation from habit rather than policy. That was precisely why it unsettled people. The system prized consistency, and I was about to test whether consistency mattered more than awareness. The decision drew on something I had never considered an advantage. Attentiveness sharpened by years of being overlooked. When you are rarely addressed directly, you learn to observe. You notice where processes drift, where assumptions harden, where the usual approach no longer fits the moment. I saw the misalignment clearly. It wasn't brilliance or instinct, it was an observation finally applied. I didn't announce the change or defend it in advance. I implemented it quietly, letting execution precede explanation. As the process unfolded, the room grew still. Conversations faded. Attention gathered around the outcome that was about to land. I said nothing. I stood ready to absorb whatever followed. The result wasn't perfect. It stabilized what had been tipping toward failure, but it showed its seams reminders of the constraints under which it had been achieved. There was no applause, no visible relief. Instead, posture shifted, assumptions adjusted. No one could dismiss what had happened, and no one rushed to celebrate it either. The success was contained, and in that containment, something changed. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was space. A loosening in my chest, a sense that I no longer had to make myself smaller to avoid provoking rejection. I wasn't elevated or protected. I was placed. And for the first time, that placement felt earned rather than provisional. As the room dispersed, reactions remained quiet. No congratulations, but no avoidance. Questions that followed were practical, focused on replication and limits rather than doubt. I noticed who addressed me directly now and who hesitated recalibrating. The shift wasn't dramatic enough to inspire loyalty or resentment. It was just enough to disrupt the assumption that I was expendable. Later alone, I examined what lingered beneath the surface. It wasn't pride. It was an alignment. For the first time, my actions and my presence occupied the same space without apology. I understood then that value here didn't come from being liked or protected. It came from occupying a function the system quietly depended on. The man who had brought me into this structure didn't comment. He assigned me an additional responsibility instead. Small, visible, closer to decision-making. No explanation followed. None was needed. It wasn't a reward. It was a recalculation. I didn't mistake the moment for arrival. One success doesn't rewrite a pattern built over years. But I was no longer peripheral. Information moved differently now. My name surfaced in conversations even when I wasn't present. It wasn't safe. It was a consideration. Conditional, revocable, but real. What surprised me most was how little I wanted to announce any of it. There was no urge to frame the moment as transformation. The satisfaction lived in something simpler. This time I hadn't waited. I hadn't stood back hoping to be chosen or spared. I had stepped forward knowing exactly what I stood to lose. In the past, I had been kept out of convenience or inertia. Now if I remained, it was because removing me would require effort and explanation. That distinction mattered more than affirmation ever could. I hadn't been chosen the way I once waited to be, but I had made myself someone they had to account for, and that was enough to change everything. The quiet that followed my small success was heavier than the pressure that had come before it. I was given more work. Not impressive, not symbolic. Just enough to confirm that my name now belonged in rooms where it hadn't before. No one congratulated me. No one challenged me either. People watched a second longer than necessary, measuring instead of dismissing. I had crossed an invisible line, and the cost of standing near me was being recalculated. I noticed it in the pauses. Conversation slowed when I approached and resumed once I passed. Not because they were about me, but because I had become a variable. I had been predictable before. Now I wasn't. The system hadn't embraced me. It had flagged me. There was one person whose behavior didn't change at all. Her name was Linda. She wasn't my superior or my competitor. She sat comfortably in the middle. Competent, neutral, reliable. She had a habit of arriving exactly 2 minutes before every meeting. Not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to seem careless. I had noticed it before. I noticed anything else about her. She shared information when it helped things move faster. She answered questions without condescension. She never made me feel like my presence required justification. In an environment where every interaction carried a cost, that consistency felt safe. I didn't confide in her out of desperation. I did it because she had earned credibility. It felt reasonable to share context, to talk through ideas that were still forming. Nothing confidential. Nothing strategic enough to feel dangerous. The first sign came quietly. A contingency I mentioned in passing surfaced later that afternoon, incomplete and slightly misaligned, circulating among people who shouldn't have known it existed. I dismissed the unease. Parallel thinking happens. Suspecting betrayal felt like importing old fear into a new situation. Then it happened again. Another detail appeared before I had introduced it formally, altered just enough to change how it sounded. What had been a careful adjustment was now framed as deviation. Context was missing. Emphasis had shifted. The idea no longer felt like mine. There was no confrontation, no resistance, just erosion. I replayed every conversation, searching for the point of leakage. The doubt felt familiar. Was I misreading this? Or was I hesitating because I finally had something to lose? The answer arrived through consequence, not confession. A decision I had been preparing for shifted without warning. Timelines moved, priorities reordered in ways that strengthened someone else's position and weakened mine. The explanation referenced information only 2 people had known in its original form. Plausible deniability collapsed. When I asked Linda about it, I didn't complain. I described what I had noticed and waited. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. Her response was calm, almost weary. Everyone has to look out for themselves. Opportunities are limited. Alignments change. It wasn't personal. That was what made it devastating. There was no villain to confront, no anger to push against, just the confirmation that when a choice had to be made, she hadn't chosen me. The fallout came quietly. Questions surfaced about my judgment and readiness. Access narrowed. My input was requested less often. No one defended me. Not because they thought I was wrong, but because defending me offered no return. I understood then what this was. I wasn't being pushed aside because I was weak or untested. I was being moved because someone else had decided I was expendable in service of their own stability. The man who had brought me into this system knew. I could tell by the way his attention shifted, not toward me or toward Linda, but toward the situation itself. He didn't intervene. He didn't correct the narrative. It wasn't abandonment. It was an observation. If I needed saving here, I didn't belong here. For the first time, I didn't turn inward to search for fault. The betrayal didn't prove I was wrong to trust. It proved that trust had become costly. I didn't confront her again. I didn't defend myself. I narrowed what I shared. I documented everything. I focused on work that couldn't be redirected without leaving traces. I stopped seeking alignment and started building inevitability. The door I hadn't realized I was leaning against closed. And once it did, the structure felt more stable. By the end of the day, I acknowledged the loss without turning it into prophecy. Trust has collapsed, but not everything that collapses needs rebuilding. Some things fall apart because you no longer need them. If this path required me to walk without companions, I would. I had learned the cost of assuming safety. I wasn't willing to pay it again. After the betrayal, nothing dramatic followed. That was what made it harder. There were no confrontations, no clarifications, no scenes that demanded reaction. The shift announced itself quietly through omission. I was no longer included by default. My name surfaced less often in the informal exchanges that moved work forward. People didn't avoid me, but they didn't orbit me either. The space I occupied felt thinner, provisional, in a way I recognized too well. The familiarity of that sensation unsettled me more than the betrayal itself. I had lived in that quiet margin before, present, tolerated, never anchored. I worked carefully not out of ambition or fear, but because precision was the only thing that kept me from drifting. Each completed task felt like both proof of competence and evidence of how easily competence could disappear without acknowledgement. What frightened me most was how natural the withdrawal felt. My body knew this terrain. I caught myself slipping back into old habits, making myself smaller, choosing efficiency over visibility, silence over friction. The danger wasn't collapse. The danger was acceptance. I had survived like this once. I could survive like this again, and that realization felt like a threat. The moment that changed things arrived without announcement. During a meeting where I expected nothing but procedural noise, someone took the empty seat beside me. Not deliberately, not ceremoniously. He didn't look at me or signal intent. He simply sat down and continued the discussion, as if my isolation hadn't existed at all. His name was Jonathan. He was older than me, methodical in the way he spoke, the kind of person who measured words the way others measured time. He had a habit of tapping his pen twice against his notebook before writing anything down, as if confirming to himself that the thought was worth keeping. I didn't look at him right away. I kept my focus on the table, on my notes, on anything that would keep me from misreading the gesture. Proximity doesn't always mean alignment. I had learned that lesson too many times. Still, the fact remained. Someone had chosen to stand near me when they didn't have to. The choice altered the room in a way that lingered long after the meeting ended. I didn't thank him. I didn't follow up. I didn't want to turn a single act into a transaction or an obligation. Trust once fractured doesn't reassemble quickly, but the room felt different afterward. Not warmer, just less empty. The confirmation came later without conversation. A decision circulated that required visible ownership. Names attached, positions declared. When I saw my name listed, not appended or qualified but placed deliberately, my first reaction was disbelief. No one had asked whether I was comfortable with the exposure. No one had warned me. It had simply been done openly in a way that made reversal awkward. Jonathan had placed his credibility next to mine without asking for anything in return. The response wasn't emotional. It was physical. A brief tightening beneath my ribs, as if my body needed time to register the sensation of being held in place by someone else's choice. I stayed still, focused on the weight of the chair beneath me, letting the moment pass without ceremony. Others noticed. The shift registered in glances that paused in objections that didn't quite form. The narrative around me adjusted subtly but decisively. I was no longer an easy variable to remove. Linda, who had undermined me, avoided my gaze entirely, her presence shrinking in a way that required no comment. There was no satisfaction in it. The balance had simply changed. What struck me most was how clean the support felt. There were no expectations attached, no invitations to explain myself. When we spoke later, it was about work, timelines, constraints, next steps. Nothing personal, nothing symbolic. The absence of probing created a form of safety I hadn't known how to name. I didn't have to be understood to be kept. In that restraint, I found room to breathe. I existed without narrative, without justification. The simplicity steadied me more than reassurance ever could. For the first time, I understood that not all support asks for intimacy. Some support simply removes the threat of erasure. Our interactions remained precise and contained. We spoke in outcomes, not confessions. That boundary felt intentional, protective rather than distant. The work became the language we shared, and within it, clarity replaced caution. As days passed, my position solidified without announcement. I was consulted because I was already there, included because excluding me would now require explanation. No one declared that I belonged. They didn't have to. The absence of challenge was enough. The seat I occupied was no longer provisional. It wasn't granted. It was taken. The realization that followed was quiet but decisive. I didn't need a crowd. One person choosing alignment at the right moment had shifted the equation more than a room full of cautious neutrality ever could. The math was simple. 10 people choosing safety could not outweigh one person willing to stand where it mattered. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic had occurred. No reconciliations, no declarations. But the precarity that had followed me since the betrayal was gone. In its place was something steadier and more durable. I knew where I sat. I knew my name belonged there, and I knew without testing it that removing me would now require intention. I wasn't saved. I wasn't redeemed. I was simply still there, and this time someone had chosen not to walk away. The change didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly like furniture rearranged, while I wasn't looking subtle enough that no one could point to a moment when it happened, but solid enough that everyone adjusted their steps around it. After everything that came before, I was no longer an absence and people stepped over. My name appeared where it was supposed to, not highlighted, not underlined, simply present. People began to ask my opinion in passing, not ceremoniously, not with deference, but with the assumption that my answer belonged in the room. I understood then that power doesn't always arrive with permission. Sometimes it arrives because no one bothers to question why you're already there. I wasn't favored. I wasn't shielded. If anything, the attention felt utilitarian, as if I had become a tool people were willing to use because it worked. That was enough. I had spent too long mistaking warmth for safety. This was different. This was structural. I didn't feel celebrated, but I felt fixed in place, and that steadiness changed the way I carried myself. I spoke less, chose words more carefully, and stopped trying to anticipate what others wanted from me. The ground beneath my feet no longer felt borrowed. The new conflict arrived without drama, wrapped in professionalism and polite avoidance. There was a decision that needed to be made, one with real consequences and no clean outcomes. Everyone agreed it mattered. No one wanted to attach their name to it. The conversation circled the issue with practiced skill, passing responsibility back and forth without ever setting it down. Risk hung in the air, acknowledged but untouched. I watched people who had once spoken with confidence now lean back into caution, protecting reputations that had grown comfortable. Linda remained conspicuously neutral. She spoke just enough to appear engaged, careful, never to stand too close to the problem. Her distance was strategic, a way of preserving the image of reliability without earning it. It was familiar behavior, the kind I had learned to recognize after years of watching others choose safety over substance. What surprised me wasn't her avoidance, but how little it affected me now. I wasn't waiting for her approval or her misstep. I was watching the space she left open. I realized in that moment that the hesitation around the table wasn't about uncertainty. It was about fear of consequence. Everyone wanted the outcome without the exposure, the success without the signature. That gap, the space between need and willingness, was where opportunity lived. I felt it settle into me, not as excitement, but as clarity. If I stepped forward, there would be no applause and no guarantee of support. If I didn't, I would confirm what some still suspected, that I belonged only when conditions were gentle. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't frame my choice as courage or necessity. I simply stated it. I said I would put my name on it. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The room adjusted again, this time more noticeably. No one objected. No one rushed to offer help. A few faces registered surprise, others relief. Responsibility had found a host, and that alone was enough to change the temperature. What mattered wasn't that I volunteered. It was that I did so without explanation. From that point on, the work moved differently. I didn't overhaul systems or make grand gestures. I made small adjustments that shifted emphasis and reordered priorities, changes subtle enough to appear procedural but sharp enough to alter outcomes. I followed the rules precisely, which made it impossible to challenge my decisions without challenging the structure itself. Some people lost advantages. They had relied on benefits that had never been guaranteed but had long gone unquestioned. Nothing was taken from them directly. It simply stopped flowing their way. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Conversations quieted when I entered the room, not out of fear but recalibration. People watched more closely, weighed their words, adjusted their strategies. Linda found herself excluded from discussions she had previously dominated. Meetings moved forward without her input, not as punishment, but as efficiency. There was no announcement of demotion, no confrontation to point to, just a series of omissions that spoke louder than any accusation could have. What struck me most was the silence. No one declared success. No one openly resisted. The absence of reaction was the reaction. Systems have a way of revealing loyalty through inertia, and when momentum shifts, those who depended on it are left standing still. I didn't need to watch anyone fall to feel the balance change. I could sense it in the way decisions finalized without debate, in the way my name carried weight without requiring defense. For the first time, I understood that revenge doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't demand raised voices or moral victories. Sometimes it's simply the removal of reliance. I had once believed that making someone feel the pain they caused was the point. Now I saw that the deeper power lay in no longer needing them at all. The absence of dependence did more damage than any argument ever could. The man who had first offered me structure said little during this period. His presence remained steady, observant, as if he were watching a process complete itself rather than guiding it. When he did speak, it was to hand me additional authority without commentary, a quiet acknowledgement that the role I occupied was no longer provisional. Others noticed. Authority once assumed tends to become permanent when reinforced by habit. I felt no urge to justify myself. The desire to be understood, to correct misinterpretations, faded as my position solidified. I had spent too much of my life explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. Now, the explanation felt unnecessary, even burdensome. Understanding was optional. Relevance was not. I chose relevance every time. By the end of it, the order had shifted enough that no one questioned where I stood. I had a seat that wasn't offered or defended. It simply existed. I had the right to sign off on decisions not as a privilege, but as a function. Those who once hovered at the center found themselves orbiting instead, unsure when the change had occurred, but unable to reverse it. There was no satisfaction in their confusion, only confirmation that the system now recognized what it hadn't before. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The chaos that once defined my place in the world had given way to something quieter and more resilient. I wasn't temporary. I wasn't a placeholder. I was part of the structure, and that fact didn't depend on anyone's approval. The order had been established not by force or argument, but by presence and persistence, and for the first time I knew it would hold power. Once it settles into your hands, doesn't feel the way people imagine it will. There was no surge of triumph when I realized how much authority I now carried, no rush of vindication waiting to be spent. It felt quiet, almost ordinary, like discovering that a door you'd pushed against for years was no longer locked. I could sign when signatures were needed. My voice changed the direction of discussions without effort. Decisions moved forward with my name attached not as decoration, but as weight. The chaos that once surrounded me had faded into something stable and unremarkable, and inside that stability, I felt calm rather than satisfied. The calm surprised me. I had expected some hunger to linger, some need to make the past answer for itself. Instead, what I felt was distance. The need to prove anything had thinned out, replaced by a clarity I hadn't known before. I was no longer fighting for space. I occupied it. That distinction altered everything about how I moved through my days, how I listened, how I chose when to speak, and when to remain silent. The opportunity came disguised as routine. A document crossed my desk, one among many its implications, clear the moment I read it. With a single signature, a brief endorsement, I could influence an outcome that would ripple through the structure quietly but decisively. The action would be lawful, defensible, even applauded by some. No one would question my right to do it. In fact, a few might have expected it. The person most affected by the decision was Linda, whose choices had once narrowed my own path, who had calculated her way past me without apology. I didn't react immediately. I set the document aside and finished what I was doing, aware of the way the moment hovered at the edge of my attention. The choice didn't frighten me. It intrigued me not because of what it would do to her, but because of what it asked of me. This was the moment people like to point to when they talk about justice, about balance being restored. It would have been easy to frame the action as inevitable, even righteous. The system would absorb it without resistance. What stopped me wasn't compassion or restraint imposed from the outside. It was a question I couldn't avoid asking myself. If I did this, who would I be afterward? Not in theory, not in public perception, but in the quiet continuity of my own life. I had waited so long to stop being at the mercy of other people's decisions. I had imagined this kind of leverage more times than I could count. Now that it was real, it didn't feel like the culmination of anything. It felt like a fork in the road. Memories surfaced uninvited, not in sharp flashes, but as a steady background hum. Being dismissed, being labeled, being reduced to an inconvenience that could be moved aside without consequence. I recognized the familiar temptation to reverse roles, to let power answer pain in the only language it seemed to understand. The realization that I could make her feel smaller was intoxicating in its simplicity. Power offered me that option freely. It did not demand justification, but it also didn't demand that I take it. I met with Linda briefly, not because I owed her anything, but because clarity matters when choices carry weight. The conversation was efficient, stripped of drama. She spoke carefully, referencing pressures and constraints, framing past decisions as necessities rather than betrayals. There was no apology worth naming, just an explanation shaped to sound reasonable. I listened without interruption. I didn't argue or correct the record. I didn't recount the cost of her choices. Silence in that moment felt like the only response that didn't invite her to rewrite the story around herself. When she finished, she waited, perhaps expecting a reaction, perhaps bracing for consequence. I gave her none. I stood, thanked her for her time, and left the conversation exactly where it was. The absence of confrontation unsettled her more than anger would have. I could see it in the way her composure tightened in the questions she didn't ask. I had taken something from her without touching her at all, the ability to position herself at the center of the narrative. Alone again, I returned to the document. The decision was still available, unchanged by our meeting. I considered the ease with which I could sign and move on the efficiency of letting the system interpret my intent however it wanted. But something had shifted. The urge to intervene felt heavier now, not because it was wrong, but because it would tether me to a version of myself I no longer needed. I had spent too many years reacting, defining myself in opposition to harm. I didn't want the next chapter of my life to be organized around her, even in retaliation. So I did nothing. I didn't add my name. I didn't make a call. I stepped away from the process, entirely allowing it to continue on its own trajectory. The outcome unfolded as it was always going to, shaped by broader forces and quieter calculations. Linda lost influence anyway, her position eroding through mechanisms that had nothing to do with me. She couldn't point to my hand in it. She couldn't accuse me of interference. The system moved forward, indifferent and thorough. The effect on the people around me was subtle but unmistakable. No one praised my restraint. No one commented on the choice. What changed was the way my decisions were received afterward. Fewer questions, less second-guessing. Trust, the practical kind, began to gather around my silence. People understood, without needing explanation, that I wasn't interested in using authority as a weapon. That understanding carried more weight than any dramatic assertion of fairness ever could. The man who had guided me through the early stages of this world noticed, as he always did, without remark. He didn't ask why I'd stepped back or whether I regretted it. He simply handed me more responsibility, a quiet acknowledgement that the test had been passed. His confidence wasn't expressed in words. It didn't need to be. The work itself was the validation, the unspoken agreement that I was ready to hold what I had been given without letting it define me. I reflected on how different this moment felt from the ones I'd imagined during my worst nights. I had once believed that healing would arrive in the form of visible consequences for those who had hurt me. I thought freedom would look like watching them reckon with what they'd done. Standing here now, I understood how narrow that vision had been. Punishment might have offered a brief sense of balance, but it would have kept me anchored to the past, measuring my growth against their decline. I didn't forgive them. Forgiveness wasn't the point, nor did I absolve them of responsibility in my own mind. What I chose instead was separation, a clean boundary that required no ceremony. I didn't carry them forward with me, not as enemies, not as reference points, not even as lessons I needed to revisit. The choice to let go wasn't noble or generous. It was practical. I had other work to do. When I finally closed the folder and set it aside, the gesture felt definitive. Not because it ended anything dramatic, but because it marked the last moment I allowed their choices to influence mine. I didn't forgive. I didn't forget. I just didn't bring them with me. And as I stepped forward, the weight I'd been carrying for years loosened, not because justice had been served, but because I no longer needed it to be. 3 years had passed since the night I first slept in a place that wasn't home. The work had changed. My title had changed. The rooms I entered now required invitations that weren't easily given. The life I live has a rhythm that no longer startles me. Mornings arrive without urgency. I wake, dress, pour coffee, check the day ahead without scanning for exits or preparing for impact. Nothing about it feels dramatic. That is the point. Peace is no longer something I borrow from good circumstances. It is the baseline I return to, even when the day becomes complicated. I don't brace anymore. I don't negotiate my right to exist in the space I occupy. Someone asked if I could stay longer than planned. One more meeting, one more adjustment before we moved on. I checked the time and said no. Not because I couldn't, not because I was tired, simply because I didn't want to. I didn't explain myself. No one asked me to. The conversation continued without pause, as if my refusal were an ordinary fact rather than a request requiring approval. I noticed the absence of tension only afterward, the way silence becomes noticeable once the noise is gone. The invitation for the trip arrived without ceremony. It wasn't framed as a reward or a symbol, just an extension of work that happened to involve travel. The yacht wasn't described as anything special. It was simply where discussions would continue, where decisions could be made without interruption. I accepted, packed what I needed, and left the rest behind. The trip didn't feel like an arrival. It felt like continuity. Out on the water, days settled into a steady pattern. Meetings, shared meals, long stretches of quiet that didn't need filling. Europe passed in soft increments, coastlines appearing and receding without demanding attention. Sometimes I stood on deckhands resting on the rail, not to be seen, but because the air felt right there. I belonged in that space for a simple reason. My name belonged to the work that had brought us together. I noticed the disruption before recognition, a brief hesitation in the flow of attention. My parents stood a short distance away, unmistakable, once my eyes adjusted. They looked careful, uncertain, dressed with effort, but without ease. Guests rather than participants. Time had changed them, but what struck me wasn't how different they looked. It was how little authority they carried here. My brother wasn't with them. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. Whether he had chosen not to come or hadn't been told, I couldn't say. It didn't matter. His absence was its own kind of answer. The same silence he had always chosen. There was no rush of adrenaline, no surge of anger. Recognition arrived quietly like a fact that didn't require reaction. I didn't turn away or prepare for confrontation. I watched as they scanned the room, searching for something familiar to anchor themselves. When their eyes met mine, confusion came first, then disbelief tightening into something like panic. They knew me. I could see it in the way they tried to place me inside a hierarchy that no longer existed. They approached hesitantly, unsure of their right to close the distance. I stayed where I was, not frozen, steady. When they said my name, it sounded tentative, stripped of authority. They reached for small talk that didn't fit comments about the setting that only emphasized how out of place they were. The imbalance was unmistakable. For the first time, they were the ones searching for ground. I didn't remind them of what they had said years ago. I didn't recount the night the door closed behind me or the months that followed. None of it needed rehearsal. When the pause came, when expectation hovered between us, I said only what was necessary. I told them I was doing well, evenly, without edge or performance. The words weren't a defense or a challenge. They were simply true. There was nothing for them to argue with, no opening to reclaim relevance. They waited as if expecting more. An accusation, a demand, a plea. I gave them none. My calm unsettled them more than anger ever could have. It made clear without cruelty that the center of gravity had shifted and they were no longer part of it. I excused myself before the conversation could stretch into something else. The choice was deliberate. I didn't linger for explanations or reactions. I turned and walked back into the life that had continued without interruption. The movement felt final, not dramatic, just decided. I didn't look back. Around us, the world went on. Conversations resumed. Laughter rose and fell. The yacht moved steadily forward. No one stopped to watch. No one speculated. My parents stood where they were briefly unmoored, their discomfort unnoticed by anyone else. There was no audience for it. They were simply no longer central. Later alone, the weight of the encounter settled softly. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. What I felt was space. The wound that had shaped so much of my life loosened, not because it had been addressed, but because it no longer directed my movement. I didn't need to prove that I deserved to exist. I had lived. That was enough. The word mistake surfaced briefly the way it once echoed like a verdict. It felt smaller now, clearly tied to their fear rather than my reality. I didn't need to rewrite the past. I simply stopped carrying it forward. Family, I understood, isn't guaranteed by blood or proximity. It's defined by presence. Who stays when staying costs something? The people who had stood beside me without demanding explanation were the ones who mattered now. The rest belonged to a chapter that had already closed. As the evening wound down, I returned to work to conversations that required no context or apology. My name carried weight here, built from consistency rather than inheritance. The story hadn't ended in confrontation. It had ended by continuing. I am no longer the person they rejected. I don't need their understanding to move forward. I don't need their regret to feel complete. When the night ended, I checked my phone, once silenced a message from a number I recognized but didn't intend to answer, and slipped it back into my bag. I joined the next conversation already in progress and picked up the work where it had paused. Nothing needed explanation. For me, nothing unusual had happened. If you've ever been labeled something meant to limit, you know this. Survival is not the end of the story. Living well is. And sometimes living well looks very small. Choosing where you stand, choosing when you leave, choosing not to respond. If you're still here, still choosing to continue, leave a sign of it, not for me, for yourself, as proof that you no longer need permission to exist.